Hello guys, and welcome to another episode of my lecture. On today's episode, we will be talking about indirect or circumstantial evidence. And what does indirect or circumstantial evidence mean? Let's turn to my notes and let's look through salient things that has been stated. So the first thing is that it denotes the relevant facts from which the existence or non-existence of fact in issue may be inferred, as stated in the case of AHMED versus the state and TAGWONOR versus the state. It is the evidence that does not directly prove the existence of a fact or happening, but which gives cue to the logical inference that such fact exists or that the happening occurred, as stated in the case of IGABOLE versus the state. A speculative or conjectural evidence cannot be basis for circumstantial evidence to convict a person for the offense of murder, as stated in the case of IDIOK versus the state. For a defendant to be held responsible in such circumstance, there must not be any coexisting circumstances which would weaken or destroy the inference that such defendant is guilty. Now, if we look at the case of IGHO versus the state, the court invoked the last seen principle as part of circumstantial evidence to convict accused, since the victim's body could not be found and the accused was the last person that saw him. In the case of ARICHIE versus the state, a taxi driver stated that he drove the car into the river with the victim and he was later admitted into the Unibe hospital. The court, however, stated that to support a conviction, the circumstantial evidence must not only be cogent, complete, and unequivocal, but compelling and lead to the irresistible conclusion that the accused and no one else is the murderer. It must leave no ground for reasonable doubt. The court found his statement not to be true and held him liable for the death of the victim. We can also look at the cases of OLUSHOLA versus ADEKPELA. We can look at the case of ATTAH versus the state and Moses Jua versus the state. Now, you see, one very interesting and intriguing thing about circumstantial evidence is the fact that we do not have a direct evidence as to the facts in issue, but when we read all the pieces of evidence here and there and we put them all together, it must lead us to the irresistible conclusion that this person committed this act. So for example, there is this Kolade case, Kolade versus the state, where somebody drove another person from Lagos to Edo State, and the last person that saw him in Lagos when he decided to drive him to Edo. When they got to Edo, they never saw him again, and then they arrested him and said, can you please give us a cogent explanation as to the whereabouts of this person? And he could not give any, and then they convicted him for murder. And then people will be asking the question, but there is no proof that he killed. However, there is no explanation as to his whereabouts. So you see, when you are talking about circumstantial evidence, as we can also see in the case of IGHO and the state, we can see in ARICHIE and the state, there must be cogent and complete and unequivocal and compelling evidence. In the case of Biliaminu Bello and Miriam Sanders, which I've always been using as my example, yes, Ibrahim cannot testify that Miriam Sanders actually stabbed Biliaminu Bello. However, when we look at the circumstances of the case, it leads us to the irresistible conclusion that she killed him. Why? Because the gateman did not report that as at the time of the crime, any other person burgled the house, came into the house, or did anything in the house. And then there are only 3 people living in the house: the house girl, Biliaminu Bello, and Miriam Sanders. So, an hour before the incident, someone testified that knife was removed from the woman's hand 4 times, and also the broken granite bottle was removed. And all of a sudden, 1 hour later, we could find that this man was already dead with 12 stabbed wounds. And then you are beginning to ask the question that there is no direct evidence, and in the absence of direct evidence, you cannot say that she killed him. No, if we look at the circumstances of that particular case, she can be convicted based on circumstantial evidence, and that is what exactly the court said. The court said that yes, we do not have any direct evidence, but because of the circumstances, we are convicting this person. So I would love you to read through OLUSHOLA and ADEKPELA, ATTAH and the state, and Moses Jua versus the state. In my next video, I will be teaching hearsay evidence. I'll see you in my next class.